When Cicero talks about the history of the Etruscans, he tells us a story about a farmer deep in central Italy. The farmer is ploughing a field, as one of such a title is wont to do, when all of a sudden the ground beneath him forms a huge furrow, and from it springs a young boy. Instead of checking his house for carbon monoxide poisoning and calling it a day, the farmer cried out and soon assembled the entire town. All the Etruscans came together on this field and gazed at this young boy who seemed to speak with all the wisdom of an old man, of a sage. As the boy spoke, the Etruscans eagerly transcribed what he was saying, believing his words to be the words of the gods, a way to speak their language. The information he gave them became their science, their lifestyle, and the foundation of the Etrusca Disciplina, a definitive guide on how to divine the will of the gods. Welcome home. Today I've decided to talk to you about the Etruscans. They were an ancient civilization around in central Italy before the Romans, and they occupied Etruria right here for more than 700 years, from around 900 BC until they were conquered, their language mostly extinguished, their literature lost, and their culture kind of completely absorbed by the Romans, which happened at the end of the first millennium BC. All roads lead to Rome, or whatever they say. Before all that, they built some of the earliest cities in Europe and significantly influenced early Roman civilization through their art and architecture and governance. The Etruscans, known to themselves as Rasena, deriving from the word rasna, which means, I think, just the people, were quite renowned for their sophisticated metalwork and having quite a strong navy, and also for teaching the Romans the alphabet, which we're using right now to communicate in, the very same. Because of the way the Romans went about doing their whole empire, we don't have a lot of primary Etruscan literature, at least not that we are able to read. And a lot of what we understand about this culture actually comes from later writings of the Romans who were recounting the stories of the Etruscans. We also do have the physical remains of the cities and the cemeteries they left behind, which give us quite a bit of information as well. The Etruscans did have their own language, separate and coming out way earlier than Latin. But much to the dismay of nerds everywhere, it is yet to be fully understood and translated. Archaeologists have found around 13,000 Etruscan inscriptions dated from around 700 BCE to 50 CE, but we don't know what they say. Unless they got the names of the gods on there, then we can kind of figure that out. And actually, I'll level with you a little bit here, guys. The Etruscan language and its connection or lack thereof to other languages has led to a little bit of contention and is widely a mystery, a source of long-running speculation in the field. Because if we had more information about it, we'd be able to answer the question, where the hell did these guys come from? Which a lot of people are really interested about when it comes to the Etruscans, whether they were an indigenous population or whether they were invaders from somewhere else. Personally, I don't know if it matters too much, although I think the general consensus at the moment is that they were indigenous to that land. It is, as of yet, not definitive. The Etruscans are now believed to have spoken a pre-Indo-European language, which essentially means it was a language spoken in Eurasia in prehistory. So who knows? It is now, however, widely believed to be related to the Tyrcenian language family, which in itself is an isolate, so that's as far as we can trace her back. There were subdivisions of the Tyrcenian language family spoken in the Alps. This is the Raetic subdivision, and then also in the Greek island of Limnos, the Lemnian. So it's generally related to these two spaces, but it's not the same exact language. The Etruscan alphabet is derived from the Greek one. More specifically, the script that was used in Euboea that would have been brought over to southern Italy by the ancient Greeks doing their colonializing thing. They established quite a few settlements in southern Italy throughout the 8th century BCE. But although it's using a script we're familiar with, the language itself we don't understand. So linguists and Etruscologists can read the inscriptions this culture left behind and kind of with a rough idea of what the words would have sounded like, but as of yet cannot know what they mean. The script does not maketh the language. Now, the most important Etruscan cities were in this southern region here in Tuscany. Etruscan, Tuscany. We have Veii, Cervetri, Tarquinia, and Volci, most of which had populations of between like 25,000 to 40,000. So all these little city-states shared the common Etruscan language and culture, even though they were governed independently. They really flourished and just kept kind of going north and north. And some of these city-states got incredibly wealthy and powerful. We've been over this. Wealth, power, living in the beautiful, transcendent fields of Tuscany. Yeah, it's time for the sacred act of creating art to commence. Etruscan art was heavily influenced by the Greek art happening at the same time, just across the road. But they did have their own distinct characteristics. And the Etruscans were very, very good at terracotta figurative sculpture. The elite in Etruria were lovers of luxury. They imported a lot of goods from Greece just to show that they had the money to do so. But something that's quite unique about them is this idea of art and sculpture as private decoration. With a lot of ancient civilizations, the ability to put your wealth on display devote larger than life statues to your local temple was what you did as a rich person. Their art was quite utilitarian, being used very collectively, and shows up a lot in religious or funerary settings. They also, unlike the Greeks, were not very fond of nudity. I'm sure if I told you to picture a Greek statue in your mind, I'm like 87% sure that statue is naked. And I know it's not because you're a weirdo, it's just because that's how they did it. The Etruscans weren't too fond of this kind of idea. They always depicted people clothed, except for one very characteristic type of a mother nurturing a baby at her breast. One of their most renowned pieces of work is this statue of Apollo from Veii. The use of terracotta to build these monumental statues is quite unique. And again, although the face and hair are reminiscent of Greek art, they're very distinctly Etruscan, and the clothes, forget about it. I've never seen Apollo wear anything before. His hair is tied up with a ribbon. This is Etruscan fashion. The more you compare their art to the Greek art, the more differences you'll find. They also showed off their artistic talents in wall painting and metalworking, including these especially stunning, breathtaking, absolutely sublime bronze mirrors, which are often engraved with mythological scenes on the back. Quite a luxury to obtain one of these. They started being produced around the 6th century, and the practice had completely stopped by the time the Romans got in there. And one may think that owning a mirror is not necessarily a sign of luxury, but I would disagree with that one. Just think about how often we look at ourselves now. I'm trying not to look at myself right now. We are so miraculously surrounded by ourselves at all moments of the day. Even if you try and take a photo of something lovely, you could be bombarded with your own face in the camera. I live in a small apartment and there are at least 3 mirrors I could go to right now. Not that people never saw themselves back in the day. Remember Narcissus in his pond? But the image of the self was much less pervasive. And owning a mirror like this of bronze engraved is quite the status symbol, especially for Etruscan women. In the tombs of Etruscan women, sometimes they're depicted in wall paintings holding these mirrors. They usually would have been given as a part of a bride's dowry and would have been with them for their whole life. They would have used it daily, which is interesting because they were of such monetary and sentimental value. They are often found buried with their deceased. But when they are found like this, an inscription has been added on the front reflective side, essentially rendering the mirror useless because it too is dead. It's of the grave. Anywho, I'm very into mirrors. Like I said, the Etruscans imported a lot of their vases from Greece. Did I say that? I meant to say that if I didn't. But they did also make their own vases. They developed this lovely Burkert style, this black glossy finish across all their pottery. A lot of the Burkert pottery that you'll find is just completely black. Sometimes there's like little incisions and engravings, but it is very rarely ever painted. So now I know the backstory. A lot of the fascination about Etruscans comes from their intensive and extensive religion, which we know very little about. But we do know little. We know little, just very little. I opened up this video talking about the little boy that was plowed from the earth. His name is Thius, and he was like a prophet. He is the one who showed the Etruscans how to divine the will of the gods, which was something they were very invested in. There is a burial which dates back to around the 10th century BCE in Tarquinia, which is around the beginning of the emergence of these Etruscan city-states. And right here, at a time where cremation was the typical burial practice, a young boy was buried in the ground. This spot specifically seems to have been a place of ritual importance and could very well have been the field from which Thius was plowed. Why do I believe this? Well, there is evidence for a lot of ritual activity at this site. And the remains of the child buried here have revealed that he was an albino child and most likely had epilepsy when he was alive. We know that sometimes in antiquity, however interesting it may sound to us now, epilepsy and seizures in general were seen as some kind of sacred affliction. There's this idea which we see in ancient texts where episodes of seizures could be oracular in nature. So the people experiencing them were thought to be seeing something divine, seeing something that nobody else could see. Look, that's neither here nor there, but it's possible that these traits that we know this young boy had would have set him apart from the people around him. And people have argued that this would have led to him being seen as some kind of prophet or someone who could have seen things that other people weren't seeing. Maybe that he was possessed by a god or knew how to speak to them. So historians have argued that the burial of this child and who he was in life might have been the basis of the origin myth of Etruria, the myth of Thius. Something to think about. Anyways, let's talk about the Etruscan religion, shall we? So we can figure out why they're trying so bad to talk to the gods. The Etruscan religion was centered around and kind of obsessed over 2 main phenomena: nature and city. The two, believe it or not, are related and can, with the help of a little bit of magic, a little bit of ritual, be pushed into a lovely harmonious relationship which is beneficial for the people living in this society. I think it's quite lovely that the Etruscan religion has this connection between nature and city show up in their beliefs. For me, and I'm sure some of you can relate, the two feel so diametrically opposed to each other. Living in the city feels like a rejection of nature to me. And even though I love it, I gotta return to nature at some point, every so often, just so I can like feel like a real person, you know, touch grass. Is that what they say? Also, if I touch too much grass, I feel like I need to regain some kind of sense of movement in my life by being in the city. The idea that the interaction between these two things is something harmonious and that they can coexist and are in fact two parts of the same whole is a really lovely way to look at it. Although the Etruscans didn't have skyscrapers that block out the sun, so I don't know if I can fully commit to that. As we were saying, the Etruscans were renowned for their systematic religious worship, which made this, and I'm quoting, the mother of superstition to the Romans. And this is coming from the guys that would lick their finger and rub it behind their ear to get rid of bad thoughts. Someone should tell them about not stepping on the cracks that don't break their mother's back. Though the Romans were incredibly superstitious, a lot of their beliefs and superstitions did actually stem from the Etruscans. And they had quite a lot of respect for them. They were actually kind of in awe of them. The concept of the Etruscan cosmos was divided into a segmented wheel, and each of these segments were under the control of a specific deity. And they're more or less generally like benevolent or evil. Now, the Etruscan pantheon was very separate to the contemporary Greek one. But because of this influence in art and in culture that the Greeks had over Italy at this time, as time goes on, they sort of start to overlap a little bit. And as such, we can attempt to align the Etruscan gods with the Greek ones that we might be more familiar with. So Tinia is this Zeus-like character. He does the lightning, you know, you've read Percy Jackson. But he's not actually the only one who can do this. This is a very unique Etruscan thing. Etruscans recognized 9 separate gods who could make thunderstorms, and there are 11 different kinds of thunderbolts. I'm feeling like they probably got a lot of rain. 3 of these thunderbolts are created by Tinia. There's a good one, which is just like a nice little thunderstorm, I guess, that is plentiful and rains onto the crops. Then there's kind of a middle ground thunderstorm, which is sent on the advice of Tinia's council of gods. And this had the potential to cause harm, but could just as equally pass over. And then there is the actual devastating lightning storm is sent by Tinia and is completely just changes the vibe of a place. Like a place is not the same after this, and it has to be re-understood and re-trod upon in a whole new way. Tinia also has some kind of relation and attachments to the underworld and to this divine idea of boundaries. Minerva, which, yes, sounds like Minerva, which is the Roman equivalent of Athena, she could also control the weather, including lightning, yeah. She also dabbled in war and prophecy and health. Then there's Uni, this is our Hera type character. She brings fertility and childbirth. We have Artemis, which, take a wild guess what that one is. Artemis, you know, the Greek version, is incredibly important in the Greek pantheon, but is kind of a minor figure here and is also sometimes depicted as a male in Etruscan religion. We have Fufluns. He's a very, very important god, second only to Tinia, and is kind of a Dionysus-like figure. In art, he's often depicted in a drunken kind of state, or is hooking up with Ariatha, who is the Etruscan Ariadne. The most interesting god that we see depicted in art is Terms, who is kind of like the equivalent of Hermes. And he is the most representative of all of the Etruscan gods. Sometimes there's even 2 of him in one depiction. What is a little bit peculiar about the Etruscan pantheon is that, like I said, we have this idea of this council of gods, like that could advise Tinia on whether or not to shoot his thunderbolt down. This doesn't happen in a lot of places. There is no council of gods. But like we said, the Etruscans have segmented the sky into these 16 separate divisions, and the god of each ruling place sits in these spots in the sky. But it seems that it's possible for one god to move into the segment of another god, and they're almost depicted in combination. And they could almost take on the position that they needed to in order to get something done. When Terms, or Hermes, needs to guide people into the underworld, he takes on the name Terms Aitas. And Aitas is the name for the god of the underworld, or Hades. So when he becomes Terms Aitas, it's almost as if he's entering into the segment of this god of the underworld, essentially merging the 2 segments in a way. Etruscan gods were also not always anthropomorphic. You know, we see the Greek gods, we see the Roman gods, they look like people. They're always depicted as human beings. in the form of human beings. But this isn't the case everywhere, and it wasn't the case in early Etruria. There's a little bit of contention of whether or not the gods were initially seen as animals. I found there to be quite a bit of a back and forth in the research on that one, so it's up for debate, I guess. Although from what it seemed like to me, especially when we see gods like Artemis not necessarily having a concrete gender, that the gods were not thought of in human form. They were more amorphous and maybe the physical embodiments of the earth. Like the thunderstorms, they might not have had a human body surrounding them. They might have just been the existence that we can perceive. Then over time, as Greek influence becomes more and more ubiquitous, they start to depict their gods anthropomorphized. Although Eta, the god of the underworld, the Hades, is always kind of depicted either as a wolf or with a wolf's hat, which I think is pretty sick. Maybe he was both. There's no reason he has to have a concrete form. He's a god. Among this pantheon of gods, there are also two main mythological figures. Tages, we spoke about him, the sage with the features of a young boy but the wisdom of an old man. There is also Vergoia, a fairy. She is a nymph of sorts and the author of parts of the sacred books, which detail the religiously correct ways of founding cities and shrines, of draining fields, formulating laws, measuring space and dividing time. The fundamentals of society, We know about Tage's origin story. I told you that a few seconds ago. If you've already forgotten, get something checked. But Vergoia is cloaked in mystery a little bit. So clearly, the Etruscans cared deeply for the gods, and they relied heavily on how their actions would influence the world they lived in. But when all you've got is this kid and some fairy to connect the material world to the metaphysical world, how are you supposed to know what the gods want from you? You deserve a medal for asking questions that lead right into what I'm going to say next. The Etruscans were masterful at divination. This is one of the reasons the Romans were so obsessed with them. Compared to their contemporaries, they had a lot more of a structured process when it came to their practices. And we know that people ate this up because they were consulted by outside cultures for their skills and had a reputation among the Romans specifically for being quite reputable prophets. I mean, the reason we know so much is because the Romans described the Etrusca Disciplina, this catalog, this corpus of religious works, in Latin. So they clearly thought it was important enough to write down and keep alive. And many Etruscan rituals and figures are seen in Rome long after the Etruscans died out. So Tages gifted the Etruscans with the knowledge of how to divine the will of the gods. And they recorded the information that Tages gave to them and created the Etrusca Disciplina. And then his words were added to and expanded upon over years and years in Etruria. They thought it was essential to know what the gods wanted from them. The main question they had for the universe was why, if the gods wanted them to know all this stuff, they didn't impart the knowledge of that onto humanity. I'm asking the same questions. An integral aspect of Etruscan religion was the notion that human life was one small yet important facet of a universe controlled by gods, whose will manifested in nature as well as in objects that were created by humans. Roman writers repeatedly state that the Etruscans saw life and meaning in everything. Even the smallest, most common of berries could be the source of potential knowledge of the universe. I mean, we know this intuitively. So they need to know what the gods are thinking. Luckily, they have many ways of devoting themselves to this quest. I'm talking about reading omens, predicting future events, general rituals which should be maintained should one wish to remain in favor with the gods. There are step-by-step instructions on how to place the gates of a city in the correct order, how to build temples and altars, and what rules to follow when you arrive to a new settlement. It's a bit obsessive. It is a bit obsessive, but it's okay. So are we. The Etrusca Disciplina outlines three main ways that the Etruscans divined the will of the gods. Mostly, the Etruscans looked towards the sky. Like we said, the gods sat in the sky in these 16 compartments. The major gods belong to the easternmost part of the sky, the astral and terrestrial divine beings to the south. There are these malevolent and evil gods to the west, and the powerful and mysterious gods of fate and destiny and all that fun stuff resided north. They really feared evil spirits, and so they tried to manage their fate as best they could with this idea of divination. When you want to know what the gods want, you look to the sky. What's in the sky? Birds. Augurs, this is an augur, he speaks to the birds, read the sky and divined the entrails of sacrificed animals. This priesthood involved in augury can always be identified by this staff that they hold, which is called a litus. In a tomb called the Tomb of the Augurs, we see one depicted watching two birds fly above him. Maybe he's trying to divine the outcome of the wrestling match happening in front of him. Like, that doesn't seem like the most necessary thing to ask the gods about, because it's gonna happen. Like, just watch, be in the present moment. An augur would study whether birds were flying alone or in a flock, which direction they were flying in, what sounds they were making as they flew through the sky, and obviously what kind of bird they were. That was pretty important too. Look, Tages has never spoken to me. I haven't read the Etrusca Disciplina, so I don't know what these things mean. But by adding all these pieces together, an augur could tell what the gods wanted and prophesize what might come about in the future. Now, I know I've been using the word prophesize, but The Etruscans wouldn't have thought of themselves as prophets. They didn't think it was possible to influence any future outcome by knowing what the future is. It's like if you've ever seen Arrival. They didn't think it was possible to change the outcome of the future by knowing what was going to happen. They wanted to know the future so they know what role they had to play in it. Anything bad that might come up in understanding the future was just something that they would have to go through. This divination came from a desire to know their place in the universe and to act accordingly. The most famous example of an augur is Navius. He was around in the 6th century BC. And what this fucker did, I suppose someone who owned a garden was interested in harvesting some ripe grapes. So they called for an augur, of course, who else? And he walked into the garden and he looked towards the south, and then he divided the garden into 4 separate sections. He crossed off 3 of those sections, and then by watching the birds, he kept subdividing the last section of this garden until he got to one final tree, and on it was this perfect cluster of ripe grapes ready for harvest, and they were delicious. So there's your proof. I'm just obsessed with the fact that this guy walked into someone's garden, closed his eyes, did some mental maths, and then said, there are your grapes. Anyway, he ended up having a bit of a tussle with the king of Rome at the time, but that's another story. What else is in the sky? Lightning. Here's a little excerpt from this calendar that shows what lightning and thunder mean on specific days of the year. I'll read a couple to you right now. August 19th. If in any way it should thunder, the women and the servile class will dare to undertake murders. Sounds good. June 7th. If in any way it should thunder, diseases will infect men, but not many shall die. November 19th, if it thunders, welfare of women. January 7th, if it thunders, there will be a slave revolt and recurring illness. So you get the picture. Now, apart from looking at the sky, the Etruscans also like to look at the insides of animals, because, hello, that's where God is. By sacrificing an animal and cutting it open and looking at its organs, you could see the future. Specifically, the Etruscans were interested in livers and reading the livers of animals. This practice was called haruspicy, and the one who did it was a haruspice. Now, just like with the sky, you can divide up the liver of an animal to read the future. It is segmented in the same way that the sky is, in those 16 separate compartments. And depending on what the liver looks like, different things are going to come to fruition. If the head of the liver is large, that's a good sign, general good vibes. If the head of the liver is not there, that is very bad. Even the smoothness or roughness of the liver itself meant something. What's super cool and awesome is this. It is the Piacenza liver, a bronze model of an animal's liver divided into 16 sections. This would have been used to refer to as a haruspice, or to teach, up-and-coming haruspices what to look out for in a liver. And on it we see the segmentation of the universe. Each section is engraved with one or more of the main gods in the Etruscan pantheon. This actually isn't the first time a model liver used to determine the will of the gods is seen in the ancient world. The Babylonians did it too. Who else? My best friends. Haruspicy actually takes its origins from Mesopotamian practices, where organs of animals were studied to hopefully get the same result of seeing the future. It's clear that due to the spread of this practice, the cultural contact between the Near East and Etruria was occurring around the 7th century. It seems that because the liver is the largest organ, the Mesopotamians had more success doing this. And though it seems the Etruscans were influenced by this Mesopotamian practice, they really took it and ran with it and made it an art form. Like I said, the Etruscans saw the liver as correlated to the sky, and they divided it the same way they divided the cosmos. There are depictions of haruspicy in art all across Etruria, in illustrations and engraved on those bronze mirrors I was talking about for ages. In this mirror, you can see a young haruspice standing with a liver in his left hand. He's wearing the typical attire for an Etruscan priest and is surrounded by both mortals and gods. This boy in the middle here is likely Tages and could be seen as teaching this young boy how to read the liver. When the Etruscans cut open the liver of an animal, they are seeing a picture of the world in the moment of sacrifice. Like I said, they thought even the smallest of berries could contain the answers to the cosmos. If you zoom in on anything far enough, you see the blueprint of the universe. They knew this. They interpret this snapshot, this picture of the universe within the liver, because this is a seat of life. This is where life takes place. This is what life flows through. The liver is the sky. You zoom in and you zoom out and you get to the people, the city-states. It's all the same thing, just on a different scale. So what happened to these weirdos? Would you believe me if I told you imperialism? It was a very gradual process. From around 500 BCE, the political power in Italy started to shift away from the Etruscans and more towards the Roman Republic. And like I said earlier, the Greeks had been settling in southern Italy since around the 8th century BCE, so those investments are returning or whatever. Again, by 500 BCE, there were a lot of Greek city-states in this region. At first, they weren't particularly powerful, especially not powerful enough to rival the Etruscans on the seas. They had a great navy situation, but this didn't stop the Greeks from trying anyway. In 535 BCE, the Battle of Alalia took place against the Greeks and the Etruscans with the Carthaginians. The Greeks lost this battle, and this solidified Etruscan rule in the land for About 10 years. In 524 BCE, the Etruscans campaigned in southern Italy, where all those Greek city-states are. They attacked the city of Cumae, which was very important, and they were not victorious. Anyway, around the same time, Rome has gone from being a monarchy to being a republic, and they're being violent about it. It was pretty difficult at this point for the Etruscans to go up against Rome, and they couldn't extend themselves any further south. And eventually they were completely cut off from the southern part of the country. They were still able to maintain their own territory. But then, as if it wasn't enough, as if they weren't fighting a war on kind of one and a bit fronts, the Celts come in from the north. By this point, the Etruscans had expanded quite far north up into this area called the Po Valley. But Celts coming from Gaul at the beginning of the 5th century decided to take that and then keep going. They seized a bit of territory east of Etruria on the Adriatic coast. And now this is pretty bad, especially if you're priding yourself on your naval capacity. You got Celts above you, Romans below you. And then in 396 BCE, Veii falls to Rome. And after that, at the beginning of the 2nd century, Rome just took city after city, and that's it and that's all. Despite the Romans being so infatuated and so in awe of the Etruscans, that didn't stop them from basically weeding them out. But maybe they knew that was going to happen, and maybe they were just playing the role that they thought the gods had aligned for them. It's clear that the Etruscans had an intense relationship with their gods. Their lives were dedicated to the precious and precarious balance of harmony between mortal and immortal. And to try and explain and understand their place in the universe, they used their skills of divination to divine the will of the gods. And while they didn't think it was their right or their responsibility to change the future, they were pretty damn good at determining its outcomes. They looked at the sky, at the birds, at the natural phenomena that would occur daily. And they saw in those things, I think, what a lot of people now wish that they could. The Etruscans were pretty eclectic, even to their contemporaries. They were a little bit bizarre and mysterious, but they saw the will of the gods in things that other people took for granted. And maybe the Etruscans were closer to the gods than they really believed. Their practices are pretty far removed from what we understand of religion and spirituality in today's world, but they saw mundanity and turned it into divinity, a godly act if ever there was one. Okay, thanks for joining me. I hope you're having a great day. Merry Christmas, and look up at the sky and see if you can see God in the birds. Okay, bye.